The morning mist clung to the Belgian countryside like a burial shroud, and somewhere in that fog, a legend was about to be born. June 18th, 1815. The fate of Europe balanced on a knife's edge, and tucked away in the corner of a muddy field stood a farmhouse that would witness one of the most extraordinary acts of heroism in military history. But here's what nobody talks about when they mention Waterloo. Everyone knows Napoleon met his match that day. Everyone knows Wellington stood firm. What they don't know is that the entire battle, the course of European history, nearly hinged on one man with an axe defending a gate that most people have never even heard of. His name was James Graham, a corporal in the Coldstream Guards. And what he did in the next few hours would make him the most unlikely hero of the most famous battle ever fought. By the time the sun set on that blood-soaked field, this quiet Irishman would have single-handedly changed the course of history with nothing but raw courage and a woodsman's axe. I'm about to tell you a story that Hollywood couldn't make up. A story that proves sometimes the biggest moments in history come down to the smallest acts of defiance. This is the true story of the Axeman of Hougoumont, and trust me, you've never heard anything like this before. Picture this. It's 11:30 in the morning, and while Napoleon's grand strategy unfolds across the battlefield, something much more intimate and terrifying is happening at a little chateau called Hougoumont. The name means nothing to you now, but in a few minutes you'll understand why this single building became the beating heart of the entire Battle of Waterloo. The chateau sits like a fortress on Wellington's right flank. Stone walls, a courtyard, outbuildings, and most importantly, a massive wooden gate that's about to become the most contested piece of real estate in Europe. Inside these walls, a small garrison of British and Hanoverian troops have turned this peaceful farm into a deadly maze of defensive positions. But here's where the story gets interesting. Napoleon's brother, Jérôme Bonaparte, isn't supposed to take this place. His orders are simple: pin down the defenders, create a distraction, keep Wellington's reserves busy while the real attack happens elsewhere. It's meant to be a sideshow, a feint, a clever bit of misdirection. Jérôme had other plans. You see, Jérôme Bonaparte had something to prove. Living in the shadow of the most famous man in Europe will do that to you. So when he looked at those walls, he didn't see a distraction. He saw an opportunity to make his mark, to show his brother that he could deliver victory on his own terms. And that's how a tactical diversion became a full-scale assault that would consume thousands of men and decide the fate of an empire. The first French columns came marching through the morning mist like ghosts materializing from a nightmare. Wave after wave of blue-coated infantry, their bayonets gleaming wet in the pale light, their drums beating out the rhythm of doom. The defenders inside Hougoumont could hear them coming long before they could see them, that steady thump, thump, thump of military boots on muddy ground growing louder with each passing second. Lieutenant Colonel James MacDonald commanded the garrison, and he knew exactly what was at stake. If Hougoumont fell, Wellington's entire right flank would collapse. The French would pour through the gap like water through a broken dam, and the battle would be over before it really began. Everything depended on holding these walls, but walls are only as strong as the men defending them, and MacDonald had precious few of those. A handful of companies from the Coldstream Guards, some German troops, a few light infantry companies. Maybe 1,500 men total to hold a position that would soon be attacked by over 14,000 French soldiers. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. They were outnumbered almost 10-1. The French came in waves, each assault more desperate than the last. They swarmed over the walls like angry hornets, only to be met by withering volleys of musket fire that sent them tumbling back into the mud. Bodies began piling up in the courtyard, the air filled with smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And through it all, one sound rose above the chaos: the rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk of an axe biting into wood. James Graham had found his calling. While his comrades fired and reloaded in the mechanical rhythm of 19th century warfare, Graham had grabbed a woodsman's axe from somewhere in the chateau's outbuildings. Maybe it belonged to the farmer who'd worked this land before it became a battlefield. Maybe it was just lying around, waiting for its moment in history. It doesn't matter where it came from. What matters is what Graham did with it. Every time a French soldier made it over the wall, Graham was there. The axe would rise and fall with deadly precision, each blow delivered with the calm efficiency of a man who'd found his element. He moved through the smoke and chaos like death incarnate, cutting down attackers with the same methodical approach another man might use to chop firewood. But the French kept coming, and coming, and coming. Jérôme Bonaparte had thrown his entire division at this single farmhouse, and still the defenders held. The walls of Hougoumont were slick with blood, the courtyard littered with the dead and dying from both sides. The smell of gunpowder mixed with something worse, something that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. And then, around noon, everything changed. A massive explosion shattered the morning air. French engineers had somehow managed to get close enough to blow a hole in the wall. Not the main gate, not yet, but a breach big enough for soldiers to pour through. The defenders rushed to plug the gap, but they were spread too thin, fighting on too many fronts at once. That's when the French made their move on the gate itself. Picture the scene. The great wooden gate of Hougoumont, massive oak timbers bound with iron, the only way in or out of the courtyard for anyone not willing to scale the walls under fire. For hours, it had stood firm against everything the French could throw at it. Musket balls, artillery rounds, the desperate shoulders of attacking infantry. But now, a group of French soldiers had fought their way close enough to actually reach the gate, and they'd brought axes of their own. The sound of splintering wood cut through the noise of battle like a knife through silk. The defenders inside the courtyard could hear it clearly. Thunk, crack, thunk, crack, each blow, bringing the enemy closer to breaking through their final line of defense. Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald rushed toward the gate with every man he could spare, but they were already engaged with French soldiers who'd made it over the walls. The garrison was stretched to its absolute limit, fighting for their lives on multiple fronts simultaneously. And that's when James Graham made a decision that would echo through history. He looked at that gate, looked at the handful of men trying to hold it, looked at the French axes biting deeper into the wood with every passing second. He could hear voices on the other side, French officers shouting orders, soldiers preparing for the moment when the barrier would finally give way. Graham hefted his axe, took a deep breath, and walked toward the gate. What happened next would be talked about in pubs and parlours across Britain for generations to come. What happened next would be carved into monuments and written into history books. What happened next would prove that sometimes, in the darkest moments, ordinary men can do extraordinary things. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because before we get to the moment that made James Graham a legend, you need to understand just how impossible his situation had become. You need to see the trap that was closing around him and his comrades. You need to feel the weight of what was at stake. Because what Graham was about to do wasn't just brave. It was mathematically insane, and somehow, against all odds, it was going to work. The French were so close to the gate now that the defenders could hear their individual voices. Not the mass roar of an attacking army, but actual conversations. Someone laughing nervously, an officer giving final instructions, the scrape of metal on metal as bayonets were checked one last time. And still that relentless chopping continued. Thunk, crack, thunk, crack. Graham could see the gate beginning to bow inward with each blow. The iron reinforcements were holding, but the wood around them was starting to fail. Splinters flew with each impact, and through the growing gaps, he caught glimpses of blue uniforms pressing close on the other side. Here's what you have to understand about that moment. This wasn't some Hollywood scene where the hero charges in with perfect timing and everything works out beautifully. This was chaos. Pure, unfiltered chaos, where men were dying by the dozen and every second brought them closer to complete disaster. The smoke was so thick that Graham could barely see 10 feet in any direction. The noise was deafening. Musket fire cracking like thunder, men screaming orders that nobody could hear, the wounded crying out for help that wasn't coming. And underneath it all, that steady rhythm of axes on wood, like a death knell counting down to catastrophe. But Graham had an advantage that nobody else in that courtyard possessed. He wasn't thinking like a soldier anymore, he was thinking like a craftsman. You see, James Graham knew wood. He'd grown up in rural Ireland, where every man learned to swing an axe before he learned to shave. He could read the grain of timber like other men read books, could tell you exactly where a beam would break and how much force it would take to bring down a tree. And as he watched those French axes working on the gate, he realized something that changed everything. They were chopping in the wrong place. The French soldiers were attacking the center of the gate, where the wood was thickest and the iron reinforcements were strongest. It was the obvious target, the place any normal person would strike. But Graham could see what they couldn't. The real weakness wasn't in the middle of the gate at all. It was in the hinges, those massive iron hinges that held the gate to its stone frame. They were strong, sure, but they were also old, and more importantly, they were accessible from the inside. Graham looked around the courtyard. His fellow guardsmen were still fighting desperately at the walls, still trying to keep the French from pouring over in overwhelming numbers. Nobody was paying attention to him. Nobody saw him walking toward the gate with his axe held ready, which was exactly what he wanted. The plan that formed in Graham's mind was so simple. It was almost stupid. Instead of trying to reinforce the gate that was already failing, instead of adding his strength to a losing defense, he was going to do something completely different. He was going to control exactly how that gate failed. Because here's the thing about wooden gates. When they break, they don't just disappear. They fall. And if Graham could control how they fell, if he could time it perfectly, he could turn the French breakthrough into a trap. But first, he had to get close enough to those hinges to do some damage of his own. The French voices were getting louder now, more excited. They could sense victory. The gate was starting to sag noticeably, and gaps were appearing between the planks wide enough to stick a bayonet through. Any moment now, it would give way completely. Graham pressed himself against the stone wall next to the gate and raised his axe. Not to strike at the French, not to defend against their attack, but to begin the most audacious piece of military engineering in the history of warfare. He started chopping at the bottom hinge. The sound of his axe was lost in the general chaos of battle. Nobody on either side could hear one more tool striking metal and stone. But with each blow, Graham was weakening the gate's support structure in exactly the right way. This wasn't random destruction. This was precision demolition. You have to picture the geometry of what he was doing. The gate hung on two massive hinges, top and bottom. The French were weakening it from the outside, but their damage was scattered and uncontrolled. Graham's damage was surgical. He was creating a specific failure point that would make the gate collapse in exactly the direction he wanted. And then, just as he'd calculated, the French breakthrough came. The center of the gate finally gave way with a tremendous crash of splintering wood and screaming metal. French soldiers poured through the gap like water through a burst dam, their faces wild with victory, their bayonets glinting in the smoky air. But instead of flooding into the courtyard as they expected, they found themselves squeezed into a narrow bottleneck, because Graham's work on the bottom hinge had done exactly what he'd planned. The gate hadn't simply broken open. It had collapsed inward at an angle, creating a twisted barrier that funneled the attacking French into a kill zone barely 6 feet wide. Instead of facing a scattered defense spread across the entire courtyard, the French found themselves packed shoulder to shoulder in a space where only 2 or 3 men could fight effectively at a time, and standing right there, blocking their path with nothing but an axe and the kind of calm determination that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing, was James Graham. What happened next lasted maybe 10 minutes in real time, but those 10 minutes contained more raw courage and tactical brilliance than most entire battles. Graham had turned himself into a human cork, plugging the breach with his own body while his comrades regrouped behind him. The first French soldier through the gap came at him with a bayonet thrust that should have ended the fight before it began. Graham sidestepped like he was avoiding a branch while chopping wood, and his axe came down in a perfect arc that dropped the man where he stood. The second soldier met the same fate, then the third. The French couldn't understand what was happening. They had overwhelming numbers, they had momentum, they had every advantage except the one that mattered most. They had to come at Graham one at a time, and Graham was very, very good with that axe. But numbers tell, and Graham knew it. He couldn't hold that gap forever. Sooner or later, exhaustion would slow his reflexes, or a French soldier would get lucky, or simple mathematics would overwhelm even the most perfect defensive position. That's when Lieutenant Colonel MacDonald arrived with reinforcements. Not many, maybe a dozen men who could be spared from other parts of the defense, but in that narrow gap, a dozen disciplined guardsmen were worth 100. They formed up behind Graham, creating a wall of bayonets that turned the breach into a killing ground. And still, Graham kept swinging that axe, methodically cutting down anyone who made it past the tangle of collapsed gate timbers. His movements had taken on an almost mechanical precision, each blow calculated and controlled, each step positioned for maximum efficiency. The French kept coming because they had to. Jérôme Bonaparte had committed too much to this attack to call it off now. Wave after wave of blue-coated infantry threw themselves at that narrow gap, and wave after wave broke against the immovable object that James Graham had become. But something else was happening that would soon change everything. While Graham held the gate, while the main battle raged across the fields of Waterloo, a new sound was beginning to cut through the chaos of combat. Drums, but not French drums. These had a different rhythm, a different cadence that made veteran soldiers on both sides lift their heads and listen despite the danger. Prussian drums. Getting closer by the minute, the sound of those Prussian drums changed everything, not just for the battle, but for James Graham standing in that shattered gateway with his blood-soaked axe. Because suddenly, the French attacks weren't about taking Hougoumont anymore. They were about taking it quickly, before Blücher's army could slam into Napoleon's flank and end the war, which meant the pressure on Graham was about to get much, much worse. Jérôme Bonaparte could hear those drums too, and he knew what they meant. His brother's grand plan was falling apart, and if he couldn't break through at Hougoumont right now, this instant, then his entire division would be trapped between Wellington's guns and the advancing Prussians. So he threw everything he had left at that gate. Graham watched them come through the smoke, not individual soldiers anymore, but a human tide of desperate men who knew they were running out of time. They climbed over their own dead, pushed through gaps barely wide enough for a single body, clawed at the twisted wreckage of the gate with their bare hands. And Graham met them all with that axe. By now his arms burned like fire. His uniform was torn and bloody. His face was blackened with powder smoke and streaked with sweat. But his eyes remained absolutely calm, calculating each swing with the precision of a master craftsman who'd found his life's work. Behind him, MacDonald's men held their line. All's men, bayonets thrust and parried in the deadly dance of close combat. Men fell on both sides, but somehow, impossibly, the breach held. The Prussian drums were getting louder now, close enough that you could make out individual beats, close enough that French officers were glancing nervously over their shoulders toward the sound. And that's when James Graham did something that nobody expected, something that turned defense into attack in the space of a single heartbeat. He stepped forward. Not back towards safety, not sideways to better position. Forward, into the mass of French soldiers trying to pour through the gap. His axe became a whirlwind of destruction, carving space where none existed, creating chaos among men who were already pressed beyond their breaking point. It was madness. It was suicide. It was absolutely brilliant. Because in that moment, Graham wasn't just holding the gate anymore. He was advancing through it, pushing the French back on their own side of the breach, giving MacDonald's men room to follow and seal the gap permanently. The French line wavered, then broke. Men who'd been pressing forward desperately suddenly found themselves stumbling backward, unable to maintain their footing against this impossible counterattack, led by a single Irishman with an axe who seemed utterly immune to fear. Within minutes, it was over. The last French soldiers were retreating across the blood-soaked ground in front of Hougoumont, and James Graham was standing in that shattered gateway, breathing hard and still holding his axe, having just accomplished something that military historians would argue about for the next 2 centuries. He'd held the breach. Against impossible odds, with nothing but courage and a woodsman's tool, he'd held the most important gate in Europe. But here's the thing about legends. They're not made by single moments of heroism. They're made by what happens after those moments, when the smoke clears and people try to understand what they've just witnessed. Wellington himself would later say that the entire battle hinged on the closing of that gate at Hougoumont. Napoleon would blame his defeat partly on his brother's obsession with taking a single farmhouse. Military theorists would write entire books about the tactical implications of Graham's stand. But James Graham, he just put down his axe, helped carry the wounded to safety, and got ready for the next attack that never came, because by evening, it was all over. The Prussians had arrived in force, Napoleon's army was in full retreat, and the man who'd conquered most of Europe was heading toward his final exile on St. Helena. The Battle of Waterloo was won, and tucked away in the corner of that great victory was a quiet Irishman who'd changed the course of history with nothing but an axe and the absolute refusal to step aside when everything depended on standing firm. That's the story of the Axeman of Hougoumont. Not the legend that grew up around it, not the myth that got embellished with each telling, but the simple truth of what one man could accomplish when the moment demanded everything he had to give. Sometimes the biggest moments in history really do come down to the smallest acts of defiance. And sometimes, when everything seems impossible, all it takes is someone willing to pick up an axe and get to work.